Hi, so this is a short session for you around how we could promote independent learning in the post-COVID-19 classroom and what some of the evidence base says in relation to that. Obviously, we've got children returning to school into reasonably socially distant settings, children who have been forced to work alone and at home to differing degrees over the last number of months during lockdown. Like I said, it's going to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour of the evidence base relating to independent learning. My name's Jo Ashcroft. I will have met many of you before. I've worked at Aspire for 5 years as Director of Education. I have, in fact, now moved on to a different role elsewhere, but have recorded this before I've left. I hope you find it useful. We're going to focus on the research around metacognition and self-regulation. Again, some of you will have done work with the research school before on this, especially if you've worked with Aspire for some time. But as a bit of an overview in relation to that evidence, if you look at the Teaching and Learning Toolkit, metacognition and self-regulation is the second highest impact approach within that at +7 months. So definitely something worth looking at. There's an extensive evidence base, hence the 4 padlocks on there, and it's low cost. It's about tweaks to practice rather than resources or additional staff or additional adults. Within the evidence, when you drill down into it, it suggests that these approaches are particularly useful for disadvantaged learners, for lower prior achieving or lower prior attaining learners, and for older pupils as well. If we start with the definition of metacognition, it's often thought of as being thinking about thinking or learning about learning. But the actual definition of metacognition is the way in which a learner plans their own learning, monitors how their plan is going, evaluates the success of their plan, and then makes changes to their own learning behaviours as a result of that. That process helps learners to think about their learning more explicitly, and it is most effective when it's driven towards a goal, whether that's a goal for the lesson, whether that's a long-term life goal, whether it's a goal that a learner sets themselves or that a teacher perhaps has set for them. But we're really talking about the way that we want learners to ultimately independently be able to plan their own learning, monitor the success of the plan, evaluate the impact of their plan, and make changes to their learning behaviours as a result of that. So hopefully within the attachments to this, you will have been able to download or get a copy of the Metacognition and Self-Regulated Learning Guidance Report. The guidance report, like the other Education Endowment Foundation guidance report, is divided into a series of recommendations. There are 7 recommendations relating to metacognition, and we're really going to focus on recommendation 6 in this session today, which is explicitly teach pupils how to organise and effectively manage their learning independently. As well as looking at the evidence from the guidance report, we're going to be looking at a range of other sources of evidence today as well. If you would like a copy, an actual paper hard copy of the metacognition guidance report to read, make notes in, etc., then they are available within the training room at Ashgrove. In terms of what independent learning is, and what we're talking about today is we're really talking about this sort of shift of responsibility for learning. So it's not the teacher who's doing all the hard work and who is doing the bulk of the work there. It's about how we shift the responsibility for learning onto the student. Never is that going to have been more important than in the post-COVID classroom, where distancing is required. We can't get as close to learners as we used to. Children are not necessarily going to be as able to work with peers, although the research does suggest that we need to take the shift in our minds away. Independent learning doesn't just mean being able to work on your own. It's talking about the way in which you can take responsibility for learning. It's going to be more difficult than ever in the current context that we have. There's also as well within this is just one definition and one sort of summary of independent learning, but motivation's a really important element, and lots of our learners are motivated by their peers rather than internally themselves. And again, when children are working at a distance, that can be more difficult, and we're going to look at that today. So throughout today, we're going to keep pausing for activities and pausing for tasks. And this is going to be the first opportunity where I'd really like you to pause. Metacognition isn't something that just naturally develops, or it can, but it takes a long time to naturally develop, and therefore we don't get the benefit for our learners unless we explicitly teach children how to be metacognitive. So what I'd like us to do is start by thinking about what that we might want that to look like in our learners, particularly post-COVID. But think about a child that you've taught before, whether it's within your class, whether it's on placement, within a group that you work with, and just think, what is it that sets that child apart and makes them a really effective learner? What knowledge do they have? What skills do they have? What behaviours do you see? And what are the traits of those learners? And I'd like you to annotate, to jot it down somewhere, or just sort of take the time to really ponder that through just for a moment or two, because we will come back to it in a few slides' time. I thought it was perhaps worth clarifying at this point the difference between metacognition and self-regulated learning. The terms are often used interchangeably, but actually there is an important difference between the two. Self-regulated learning is the umbrella term that encompasses cognition. That's the bread and butter of what we do in schools, the mental processes that we're trying to develop in our learners, of them being able to know new things, understand new things, and the way in which they learn. There's metacognition that we've already talked about this morning, the definition of that, which is how learners monitor their learning and really purposefully direct their learning. If you remember, it was the way they plan how to tackle something, how they monitor the success of their plan, evaluate the success of their plan, and change their learning behaviours as a result. And the third strand of self-regulated learning is motivation. We need our learners to be willing to engage with the cognition and the metacognition in order to become a self-regulated learner. And that's really what we're aiming for in terms of independence. So within the guidance report, there's a number of case studies to exemplify really some of the things that the guidance report and the research is talking about. And on page 8 of the guidance report, if you've got a paper or an electronic copy, there's a grey box towards the start of the page, which is a case study or an exemplification about a young person named Freya. In case you don't have access to it right in front of you now, it's only short. I'm going to briefly read it to you. It says, Freya fiddled with her pencil case. Every Friday she would experience a quiet dread when facing the weekly spelling test. This week, though, she felt more confident than before. After a couple of weeks characterised by annoying mistakes, she'd worked hard in readiness for this week's test. She'd devised 2 of her own mnemonics, and she'd practised the LE ending words as well as surprise with an R repeatedly. As Mr. Thomas began the spelling test, Freya listened hard. She knew that sometimes she would feel a little pressure when her teacher moved quickly on to the next spelling, but that this week she would listen carefully and remember what she'd practised. 1 or 2 words were no doubt tricky, but Freya had weighed up her options each time and she was utterly confident in her success. Before Mr. Thomas had chance to cycle through the correct spellings, Freya sat up straight with a smile lighting up her face, fuelled by quiet satisfaction. She had already thought about her new spelling routine and how she would stick to it next week too. So if we use the example of Freya to really exemplify what we were talking about in terms of self-regulated learning being a combination of cognition, metacognition and motivation, if we think about the cognition of what Freya was having to do, she was having to learn her spellings. That was the learning, and she used strategies for that. She thought about some of the different phoneme patterns that she was finding difficult, for example, the LE endings. She also came up with some of her own mnemonics. Those are cognitive learning strategies that she was using to learn those spellings. In terms of metacognition, there's a host of things that she did there. She came up with a plan. She planned her practice, she planned the strategies that she was going to use, she identified areas where she might find it difficult, for example the R in surprise, and she put a lot of extra time into repeated practice of that. So she came up with a plan. She monitored her own difficulties with time pressure. So she said that sometimes she would feel pressure when her teacher had moved on quickly to the next spelling. So she knew that and she monitored that within the test scenario so that she wouldn't feel that pressure because she'd planned for it. She also evaluated whether the strategy had worked. She's saying before she was even told whether the spellings were correct, that she was confident and she was already coming up with a plan about how she would stick to this in future weeks. So the motivation element there is she's had to be motivated to put those strategies in place. She's had to be motivated to engage in repeated practice in order to get the outcome. She had to be motivated to persevere. However, what we see as a result of those is an increased motivation. The fact that it says she weighed up her options each time and she was utterly confident in her success. Before she even knew whether or not she hadn't been told the answers, she sat up straight and a smile lit up her face, fueled by quiet satisfaction. So that motivation that comes from that success, we'll have learners in our classroom who won't be motivated immediately, but when we really celebrate the successes that come as a result of the planning and the monitoring and the evaluating of the strategies, we can really build up the motivation of learners in our classroom. So thinking about this in the context of your own classroom and some of the learners that you're going to be teaching, we're in quite a unique position really starting this year, that you are unlikely to have had the same level of transition with your new class that you might have had in a normal year. So you may not know your learners as well as you usually would coming in. There may be a balance of how quickly you're jumping back into some of the targeted academic teaching, and that balance of how much is perhaps spent on things like health, hygiene, COVID, well-being, etc. But thinking about something that you're going to be teaching, perhaps in the next fortnight to your class, I'd like you to pause in a moment and just think, what is the cognition required in what it is that you are teaching? So whether it be spelling or whether it be a new strategy in maths, whether it be some new knowledge that you want the children to acquire in history, what is the cognition that's required and what cognitive strategies are you going to deploy within the lesson? How are you going to actively teach your learners to be metacognitive? How are you going to teach them how to plan for that learning, monitor the effectiveness of their plan, and evaluate how effective the plan was in relation to that cognition? And how are you expecting that to impact upon the motivation of the learners in your room? How are you going to notice that for them, even if the child themselves hasn't noticed the impact on their motivation? How will you notice it for them, and observe it and praise it? So pause there for a moment just to put this into context of something that you will be doing for a couple of minutes. Hopefully that task has prompted you to think about the class that you have coming in or the groups of learners that you're going to be working with, and how that impact upon motivation and ultimately independence could possibly be developed. That's something, that cognition, metacognition, motivation is something that I would suggest when you're planning in a post-COVID classroom that you really think about carefully within your lessons, and become tuned into thinking about. Interestingly, some of the research that there is around effective learners for a long time has been talking about many of the things that are to do with that sort of transfer of responsibility over to the learner to work more independently, and also that metacognitive process of planning, monitoring and evaluating and changing their own learning behaviours. There's a link in blue at the top of this screen to a report that was released in 2004 called Developing Effective Learners. This slide focuses on some of the behaviours that were identified by age 11. The next slide is by age 14 and the next slide is by age 16, which you can have a look at on your own now if you wish to. I'm guessing most of you are primary age though, who are going to be listening to this, in which case this is the most applicable. But you know, right back from 2004, it talks about the research around the most effective learners was saying things like that they were able to plan systematically, that they were able to break down tasks into manageable chunks. That was their plan, and they were able to break down that cognition. You know, they were working with others, but could see the bigger picture as well, independently as to where their learning was going. In the last statement there, were able to evaluate their work and discuss how they might improve. I would say the way that shifted in the last 16 years since then is it's not about how to improve the piece of work, it's about how to improve the learning. And that's sort of some understanding we have going forwards. Like I said, there's the link at the top. You may choose to click into that and read a little bit more. You may choose to look at the next two slides for age 14 and 16 and see the commonality as well. So have a look at those. So it would have been great with that activity at the start where we were thinking about a child who we view as an effective learner. It would have been brilliant if you could have had a conversation with a colleague about that to see some of the commonality. But whenever we discuss this as a group at any training or any events, there's lots of commonality that comes out. Staff talk about learners who are motivated, learners who want to do the piece of work well, learners who are resilient. Not the learners who give up at the first sign of finding something difficult, learners who recognise that learning is a process that they go through and it's not all about the end product, learners who behave well, who listen, who will engage in two-way conversation, who are willing to support others, who are quite ambitious, who see the goal of what they want to achieve and work towards that. Those are just some of the many things that come up every time we think about those learners. But what's also worth thinking about is where those behaviours come from, and how those learners develop those behaviours or those traits that we see. There is an element of explicit teaching. Some of those things will have been explicitly taught either by a previous teacher that they've worked with, from an adult at home. Somebody will have taught some of those strategies to those learners and some of those behaviours to those learners. There's also role models at home, and that's where there is a disadvantage gap in terms of metacognition and independence as well as academic attainment. And that can be to do with the role models that learners see at home and whether they see learners at home learning themselves and working and applying those skills themselves. Modelling within school as well. Learners are not going to naturally just know this is how I plan my learning, this is how I monitor the success of my plan, and this is how I evaluate it, and this is how I could change my learning behaviours as a result. They need to see adults using that process and modelling it to them as well. And material supports at home as well are another way in which that kind of been developed. There's a huge disparity between the access to learning materials that our learners have at home. Never has been more applicable than during the lockdown period, where some of our learners will not have been in school for 6 months now and will have been relying on the materials that there are to support learning at home. Basics, books, pens, paper, access to the internet, printer, etc. But those materials, the way in which these learners see adults in the home engaging with those materials as well. So at this stage, we're going to go on to recommendation number 6, which is the recommendation, as we said at the start, relating to independent learning. Explicitly teach pupils how to organise and effectively manage their learning independently. For those of you who have a paper copy of the guidance report, that's on page 22. Some of you may have electronic versions. And there is a link within this slide to the guidance report as well. So if you haven't been able to download it, you can go and get it from there. So spend 5 minutes reading that section of the guidance report. It's not long. It is 4 pages for you to read. So spend a little bit of time having a look through that. And I have put some question prompts on the next slide that I'd like you to refer to and think about as you go through. So as you read those 4 pages of that recommendation, what did you already know? about what's being said within here. What do you need to know more about, and how will you get that beyond this short session today? How will you be able to access more learning about that? What questions does this recommendation pose to you? Are there more questions that you want to go and find out more about? And also, is there anything that you might do differently on the basis of reading that recommendation? And we're going to come back and discuss the recommendation together once you've done that activity. We're going to start with thinking about Nathan. I think we can all agree that if we had a class of Nathans, life would be pretty fantastic. But it's interesting to think about Nathan in terms of a number of different ways. Firstly, if we go back to thinking at the beginning about the role of cognition, metacognition, and motivation. So the cognition here, Nathan has clearly been taught strategies that he can use to support his learning. So he's talking about quick flashcard challenge. We'll come on to flashcards in a moment. You'll have seen a little about them in there. But that sort of self-testing is a really high impact strategy. And he has the cognition that he has been taught that, and he knows how to use that strategy. He's also talking about testing himself on different topics within the field of cognitive science. That's called interleaving. So again, somebody's taught him that and taught that that is a good strategy to use when you're learning something and trying to remember something for longer. Testing himself. He's also looking at what he could do in terms of recalling past questions, starting off with a blank piece of paper. He has a revision plan as well in place. So all of those cognitive strategies, somebody's taught him how to use those. He then has also been taught how to be metacognitive. He's come up with a plan of how he's going to revise. He's having a technology blackout, because he recognises that he needs that. He's readjusted with some help from somebody at home. It says his dad's helped him. He's rejigged his room to be more like an office, more conducive to study, and less like a games room, managing those distractions. He's come up with that plan. He turns his phone off and goes upstairs when he's going to revise. So he's got that sort of shift in space that he recognises his focused area. He's got the plan of the cognitive strategies that he's going to use, but he's also got a revision plan. So he's not going to be panicking. He's not going to be cramming at the last minute. He recognises that he has a revision plan that he's checking off over time, and he's monitoring that by self-testing himself as well throughout and seeing the impact of that. In terms of the evaluation element of metacognition, it says he chalks up his victories and losses each day. He's looking at how successful that plan was, not just at the things that have gone well, but the things that haven't as well. And within his plan as well, he's even planned for when he's going to be having a lull, and he's not just thinking, oh, I'll probably have a lull at this point and then I'll have to give up. He's come with a plan of he'll go and have a break, he'll have a drink, he'll have a biscuit, he'll then come back to it. In terms of the motivation, that chalking up the victories and losses is a highly motivating approach for him, because he's able to see the things that he's really secure on. When he's testing material he's previously revised, he can see the impact of that, because he can see that he's learning that, learnt and retained that information. But the question on within there was, how has Nathan's independent behaviours been scaffolded strategically at school and supported by role models at home? And like we've said, it specifically says a parent is supported by turning the office space. Somebody has clearly worked with him on a revision plan. Somebody's clearly taught him these are high impact cognitive strategies that you need to be using. So it's interesting, we can't just assume that a child will naturally develop those skills, those attributes. It needs to be explicitly taught. I've put this slide in, this screen grab from the guidance report, because it is one of the most useful things I think I've looked into further in the last sort of 5 years maybe, in terms of children's learning, and that is that we need to be teaching the children the highest impact strategies for learning. I'm sure we can all think of times ourselves where we've tried to revise for something. Mine is, I always think of when I was revising for my A levels. I did a lot of rereading and a lot of highlighting. And when you look at the grid that's within the guidance report and that's screen grabbed here, those are really low impact strategies. So that's really demotivating. If a child is trying to learn something new, and I'm not talking about revising here now, but within the classroom, when you're trying to get children to retain new information, retain new learning, if we're using these low utility techniques, as they're called at the bottom, so things like getting the children to just reread what they've previously done, the evidence suggests little retention takes place on the basis of doing those. If we want children to be motivated to work and learn independently, we need to teach them using strategies that are proven to have a high impact upon learning. Otherwise, children will really quickly become disengaged in these approaches. Again, I would love to talk to you for days about some of the high utility techniques within here, but all I can more suggest is actually speak to some of the senior leaders in your schools and speak to the Aspira Research School team, and there'll be lots of people there who'll be happy to talk to you about some of these techniques. So things like the use of practice testing. We don't mean testing as in they sit and do a test paper, but as in the ways that learners self-test themselves on the material they've covered, and how that supports motivation and how it supports retention. Spacing out of that practice so that learners see they don't just know something for a day or a week, they know it longer term, etc. So have a chat to your local research school, which is Aspira, and have a chat to senior leaders. Many of the senior leaders in your school have done work on this with a Aspira Research School over the last 2 years. So there's a link here to a really easy read. Off the top of my head, I think it was about 12 pages-ish, but there's a link in blue there to a report here. And what this did was a 2-year project exploring the development of independent learning. It was in English nursery and reception classrooms, so in the early years. And what it was looking at is how children developed independent learning strategies from the ages of 3 to 5. And what they were hoping to do was almost develop a bit of an audit tool to be used when we're looking at how to develop independent learning, or the sorts of stages that learners go through within those, and the sorts of experiences or interventions or approaches that adults could put in place that seem to be most effective in encouraging children's independent learning abilities. So you may choose to read that report. Like I say, it's not a difficult read and it's not particularly long, so you may choose to read that. And we're going to talk about some of the findings over the next couple of slides. So within that 2-year study, looking at developing independent learning in those younger children, there was a number of approaches or statements, I guess, that the researchers identified in terms of the children developing their self-regulated learning and developing their independence in their learning. And they were categorized or grouped really within 4 categories. They were looking at children's emotional development, their pro-social development, their cognitive development, and their motivation, and how all of those came together to develop independent learning in those younger children. And they were able to create an audit tool, which we're going to look at on the next slide, on the basis of that. So that study, as I've mentioned, created an audit tool in terms of independent behaviours. There's just a screen grab of the top of it on this slide, but within the materials for this presentation, you have the full sort of assessment, the full audit of that. And like I say, it came from early years research. It came from looking at children aged 3 to 5. However, I can see it being equally as applicable with older learners, especially if you've got learners in classrooms who are not working in an independent way. You've got this tool in which to frame your thoughts around where their gaps are and where the deficit maybe is that's preventing them from working independently. So what I'd like you to do at this point is just pause to do an activity, and select, as it says within there, select 2 individuals in your class. It may be really difficult to do that for the class that you're inheriting if you don't know them, and perhaps it's more looking at learners who you've taught in the previous year, who you perhaps know a little bit better, but that will be very dependent on individual context for each of you. And what I want you to do is think about a learner who you would have perceived as being a really highly independent learner, and somebody who you would have said was a learner of low independence, and just complete this assessment for those learners and think, is there any really clear things that you see that are coming out as red, for those learners, that perhaps could be something that in the post-COVID classroom you really actively think about how you're going to build those in to your classroom teaching, to your classroom practices, and how you are going to actively try and teach and develop those things in your learners back in the classroom. That's the important bit from that audit, is where you identify things that where your learners are perhaps not strong and you're RAG rating it as red. How do you actively promote those things in your classroom to ultimately improve the way in which the learners work independently? So have a go at that. So the last thing that I wanted to look at today in terms of independent learning in the post-COVID classroom is that there is in an evidenced kind of ideal approach to teaching some children something new, or for somebody learning something new, that's detailed here. And that is when you're learning something, or well, let's talk about it from the teacher's point of view. If you're teaching children in your class, because you are hoping that they learn something new, you start by activating their prior knowledge. Again, speak to senior leaders in your school about this, because they know a lot about this already and will be able to talk to you about it. But essentially what you're looking to do is activate prior knowledge of the task at hand. What do they already know about the task or about this learning? Knowledge of a strategy. So if they are going to apply a strategy, what do they already know about that strategy? Have they used it before? Do they have a bank of strategies that they could pick from? And what do they know about themselves as well as learners? Are they likely to find it difficult? Are they likely to be demotivated? Are they likely to really enjoy it? Are they likely to lose motivation halfway through, in which case what can we do about that? So knowledge of self, strategies and task under the activating prior knowledge. It then suggests that you need to explicitly teach a strategy, explicit strategy instruction. Again, I think we're all fairly sound as that with that as practitioners in school. We know that we need to explicitly teach things, which is there. Then model that learned strategy. So that is still really heavily teacher-led. The teacher is modeling that strategy that they have just taught themselves. Then perhaps stage 4 might be something that some of us do, but it might be something that we don't all think about, is that the evidence suggests that once you've activated the student's prior knowledge, explicitly taught the strategy, modelled it, then you should be giving time over to memorization of that strategy. What do learners need to remember of this in the future, and how are they going to remember it? That sort of, at that point, that's half student, half teacher. You're collaborating on that together in deciding what needs to be remembered, how it will be remembered, and how you'll put time over for that. You then have guided practice. So again, it's the teachers still heavily involved in guiding that practice, but the students are much more actively involved at that point. Then a learner would be doing that independently with the teacher. Well, I would say satellite in the room. That may be difficult in some classrooms at the moment, but finding a way to just pick up if you spot misconceptions. But really, by that point, the child's doing that independently, and then that opportunity for the child to reflect on how successful was that strategy for them? How have they found it? Where does their learning need to go next? And it's that gradual shift of responsibility from really heavily teacher responsibility to really heavily student responsibility. And that really comes within the classroom. We talk about scaffolding. So from that really heavily scaffolded, the teacher is teaching the strategy, the teacher is modelling the strategy, to the teacher and student are working together on memorising it, it to the teacher and student are working together on guided practice to then largely the students working on their own. And it's really, there's going to be times where you're going to need to reflect on that structure in the post-COVID classroom, and also make sure if we're needing learners to be able to work independently, to practice this work independently, or to practice their learning independently, we kind of owe it to them to make sure that we've gone through the process of activating prior knowledge, explicit instruction, modelling, memorisation and guided practice to give them the very best shot of being able to do that and apply that independently themselves. So that's all for today. Hopefully the 4 things that kind of have come out of today that I think are especially useful from the evidence around promoting independence. The first was making sure that we as teachers, as adults working with learners, that we are thinking about the balance of the cognition, the metacognition and the motivation, and how we think about that and how we plan that for our learners. Second of all is the explicit strategy instruction of high impact strategies. So if we're wanting learners to be motivated to use a strategy independently, let's make sure they're high impact strategies. That was that Dunlosky table. So hopefully that will be something that you'll take from this and think about in relation to motivating your learners to use high impact strategies independently. Third is that audit tool, so those series of statements around what the evidence suggests makes these learners independent learners, and the sort of skills and attributes that you would see, and how you might look at that in relation to your new class, and how you might actively seek to promote those and develop those in your learners. And the fourth is this, where we finished off today, where do we have that gradual shift of responsibilities so that learners are truly prepared to work independently in the post-COVID classroom. And I guess my final question is, we also know that we have to be ready for children to work at home again if there's a local lockdown, if there's another national lockdown, if a child's self-isolating for 2 weeks. So again, how can we develop all of this so that learners could also apply this independently at home when they're no longer in the classroom with you? I hope you found it useful. Do get in touch with the Aspira Research School if you want to know any more about any of those things. Thank you very much. Bye.